All right. Good evening, everyone out there. Let me do a little bit of adjustment here on my camera because it looks like I'm a little bit crooked. Yeah, that's better. How's everybody doing out there in Facebook and on YouTube tonight? Uh, Tonight, we're going to be speaking with Matt Drew. Matt has a very interesting story. And when I first linked up with Matt on social media, let me mute my phone. I'm sorry here. I'm running some sort of crazy show. I had a microphone fall earlier. I had to pull a zip tie out and fix it. Anyway, we're Matt's got an interesting story, and his story and what he does now, and talking about small batch or single malt matters on his podcast about craft whiskeys in the United States. He was into craft coffee before he got into that, so it's kind of really cool that we're going to be able to talk to an expert in both fields. I've always been interested in whiskey and the differences and the nuances of the tasting notes in it, and frankly, it's something I want to learn about, and that's why I've got Matt on. And hopefully, I got a bunch of buddies that are going to jump on here and I ask some questions and get a good discussion going. So we'll leave you with that. Thanks for tuning into the Common Grounds podcast. We're brought to you by roastersmarketplace.com. As of now, they've got 21 small batch coffee roasters and over 150 different selections of small batch fresh roasted micro roast, if you want to call it, coffee. So we're going to roll into the intro song and then we'll be back right with you. Thank you. Hey, good evening, Matt. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. How are you?
Nice to talk to you tonight.
Yeah,
I'm doing
you
pretty
too.
good. I'm doing pretty good. We just had a quick meal of Instapot brisket tacos, man. So
Ooh,
uh,
nice.
uh, if I start, you know, needing to get up or walk around, it's not because the conversation. It's because I'm full and the
The
tacos are
food,
really,
the
really
food coma is real.
food. Yeah, I just got done with the meat sweat. So let me turn some stuff on here on my computer and get some stuff moved around. So Matt, I mentioned briefly in the introduction to the show about kind of a little bit about your past, but go ahead and tell the viewers or the listeners out there uh, kind of where you've been for the last couple years and what you've done and how
Oh
you've
man.
got to where you're at with single malt whiskey.
Yes. Oh man, we only have an hour, huh? Okay, I'll make
Yeah.
it quick. So my professional background actually is primarily in marketing and advertising. And about 2007, I'm a Pacific Northwest native from Washington State. Graduated from Washington State University. Go Cougs. And was in Chicago at the time, wanted to get back into the Northwest. And so I found a job. I was working on the agency side. And at that time on the Chevrolet account, and wanted to get back to the Pacific Northwest. So jobs were kind of scarce at the time. And I found a job in Las Vegas at a small kind of boutique agency in Las Vegas. And it sounded interesting. I'd never been to Vegas before. I've got kind of an adventurous spirit. So I decided to give it a try, threw my hat in the ring, and wound up getting the job. And when I got there, I was hired to head up the MGM Grand account. And
Which is
so
probably a big account.
that was a pretty good size account. Yeah. Yeah. And so my very first meeting with my new client, the MGM Grand in the executive conference room, I met their director of marketing, Teresa Fry. And Teresa Fry's last name is now Drew. So we over the years of me being in Vegas, we kind of cultivated a relationship, obviously, and got married and decided to start a family, and realized that Vegas wasn't exactly the best place to do that. So we picked up stakes and we actually moved for her job, and that took us to North Texas. Just north of Dallas in McKinney, Texas. And at the time, since we moved for her job, there was really nothing available for me to do in marketing and advertising. So I was doing some consulting. And one of the things that kept coming up with my clients was that at the time, there wasn't a place to get a decent cup of coffee anywhere nearby. And me coming from Washington State in the Pacific Northwest, and hopefully not to ruffle any feathers, but kind of cutting my teeth on specialty coffee before it was specialty coffee, and when Starbucks was still good, I thought, you know what? I know something about good coffee, and so I just decided, you know what, I'm gonna go for it. I'm gonna roll the dice, and I've got a strong background in marketing and branding, and I kind of combined those worlds. Started my own specialty coffee brand in North Texas called Mojo A Go Go, and worked with a roaster in Plano, Texas, and had a really good time doing it, and had kind of really been a nerd in the craft in the craft beverage category for a long time. I'd worked in craft beer right out of college on the distributor side, and was really into that, and hadn't really quite at that point started nerding out on the science and the microbiology of it yet. And that quickly changed. I attended the Texas Coffee School and really kind of honed the craft of making good coffee. And I mean, it drives my wife nuts because she can't make coffee anymore, because every single morning I've got my TDS meter out, and I'm measuring the TDS of my water. I've got my portable thermometer, so I'm testing my brew water, making sure it's the right temperature. I've got my time, I've got my grind setting dialed in, and it's, for the average person, it's it's a little bit excessive, but I mean, once you drink good coffee, you can't go back, and once you know why it's good coffee and what makes it good coffee, you can't go back to drinking kind of the commodity grade stuff.
When you start the day off with something like that, I'm just doing a total plug here, but when you start the day off with something that good, it's really hard to get a bad trajectory going the other way, unless you're watching oil prices.
Oh man.
And then, but
yeah,
it's good coffee, man, is something else. But I'm sorry to interrupt you on that.
yeah, no, I mean, and so what wound up happening, I've also just kind of been a hobbyist liqueur maker for 20 years now. And just in the course of networking and building my business, I crossed paths with a grain to glass distillery, new kids on the block at that point. They were a brand new distillery in Denison, Texas, called Iron Root Republic. And the Licorice family, Jonathan Robert, and then the mother, Marcia, they're kind of the core brain trust of the brand and of the distillery. They got together with me, and we started talking about formulating coffee liqueurs. And that conversation evolved, and the friendships also evolved to the point where now this is 5 years later, and we really consider them extensions of the family. They're very close friends. I actually worked with them and became more familiar with the distilling process and with craft whiskey at that point. I'd say, if anything, I would probably categorize myself at that time at best a novice in whiskey. And from that point onward, we moved to Colorado. I wound up selling the coffee business. Of course, held on to the passion. Sold the coffee business, and we moved to Colorado. And before we moved, and actually before we had really decided to move, I had a conversation with the Licorice family about wanting to get more involved in distilling and in whiskey specifically. But I knew at the time, I remember thinking, I want to do this. I don't necessarily think it makes sense for me to want to be a distiller. I don't think that's really where it's at. I've got a great palate. Come to find out, I'm good at blending, and at that point, the feedback was, "Have you thought about malt?" Because craft malt and local malt is something. I mean, it's kind of like coffee. Once that evolution and that momentum towards the evolution starts, then you start to veer more toward hyperlocal and the micro roasteries, and the same thing, on the craft whiskey side, because craft distilling has really only started hitting its stride in the last few years because of federal deregulation, which has been awesome to watch. But at the time, it's like, okay, I get it now. I feel the momentum. I want to be a part of it. And so that's where the idea came up, to get into malt. And so I studied malting. I started reading books and malting small batches of grain in my kitchen, and that actually wound up turning into a complete change in my career path. I was actually the maltster for an estate distillery in northern Nevada called Bentley Heritage, and that distillery is really, they've actually got a couple of different distilleries where they've got different stills and different technology in house. And so on one side, they're focused strictly on American single malt whiskey. And on the other side, they're focused on pretty much everything else. So all your American style stuff like bourbons and ryes, vodka, gin, liqueurs, like pretty much everything else that you would expect any distillery to make. So, but my professional focus with that company was on creating malts. And so I was their maltster. I had input and responsibilities on the agronomy side as well, with grain barley selection, looking at different varietals, doing field tests on them, and then post field tests, doing evaluations on yield and all that fun stuff. So, then I over the course of my couple of years at Bentley Heritage, really started getting into American single malt. And one of the things that really turned me on about American single malt is that it was, and still is, which is crazy to me, this burgeoning category that really, it's not even federally recognized as its own thing by the TTB. And so the TTB is Tax and Trade Bureau. So they are actually the arm of the federal government that's responsible for defining what different spirits are and how they can be made, and what the strict guidelines are in terms of like proof, what it has to go into the barrel at, alcohol percentage, mash bills, all of that stuff. And so American single malt, philosophically, is very much an offshoot of its Scottish predecessor. As everybody knows, Scotch single malt whiskey.
Right.
And so that's really what the model is. The challenge with that is that, as far as our government is concerned, those standards of identity for single malt Scotch whiskey don't matter yet. That's going to change, and that's actually all in process right now. But historically, there hasn't been anything saying or any legislation that has mandated that it has to be 100% malted barley, and that's the most important thing. And so, it basically, it follows the same rules as like bourbon. Bourbon has to be a minimum 51% corn in the mash bill, or else it's not bourbon. Anything in the whiskey world, if it's going to be called something specifically, like rye, if you've got a rye whiskey, it has to be a minimum 51% rye. And so in terms of a malt whiskey, it just has to be a minimum 51% malt. And that really doesn't fit the model that we're going after. So I also have a background in broadcasting and in radio. I was on the air in radio for the better part of a decade, and did a lot of production work there as well. And I still do like freelance voiceover work and all that fun stuff. And so a few months back, let me back up. So that was in Nevada, and there were a bunch of different reasons why, but basically there was an opportunity for me to take on a position with a malt startup, a craft malt startup in Montana. and it's back closer to home. I'm back in the Pacific Northwest. And it allowed me to really kind of take everything I've been doing for the last 25 years and group it together. So all the marketing and advertising stuff now was going to be brought back in terms of my daily responsibilities as the head of sales and marketing for this craft malt startup. But at the same time, I understand malting. I'm a maltster, and I can kind of use the expertise in each arena to impact what I'm doing on the other side. And so we picked up stakes. We moved out here. I live in Missoula now with my wife and my daughter and our little dog, our little cantankerous whirlwind tornado of a dog. His name's Dusty. And a few months back, I just kind of woke up. I was like, man, I really I needed to move, and it was the right thing to do from a professional perspective, but I really enjoyed being in the malt supply chain. And I really enjoyed being a part of the distilling world and specifically in American single malt whiskey. And so I be honest with you, I don't remember exactly how it happened or the thought process that led up to it. But at one point, I remember last October, I bolted out of bed at 3:00 in the morning, and the idea for the podcast just like solidified. It's like, oh shit, I got to do this. This is how I do it. This is how I keep, my finger on the pulse. At the time, what I didn't realize is there's a bunch of bourbon podcasts. There are general whiskey podcasts. There are Scotch podcasts. There was up until me, there was no American single malt whiskey podcast. And in part, again, because American single malt wasn't really clearly defined, and it wasn't really accepted as its own thing. And it's still very much in its infancy as a category. And so I thought, all right, here's the opportunity to do it, to put the podcast together and to really start. I mean, the ultimate goal is kind of to be a rallying point and to have a voice specific to the category and kind of be kind of an advocate for it, and to help people from a consumer perspective understand what it is. And that's really important too. That's one of the biggest roadblocks that we've got, is that if you go into a liquor store, depending on the liquor store and depending on what their level of expertise and knowledge on the stuff is, which varies, it's going to be in one of three places. It's either going to be over by the bourbon, it's going to be over by the Scotch, or it's going to be over in this kind of nebulous American craft category section that's kind of a catch-all. And it's like, well, I don't really want to do my homework, and I don't know exactly where this is supposed to go, so I'm just going to put it over here and forget about it. And so there's a lot of education that needs to happen. There's a lot of advocacy that needs to happen behind the category. And that's really the ultimate goal of what I want the podcast to be, and the role that I want it to serve kind of on a bigger picture. So
well, congratulations on being #1 single malt podcast in the world, Matt. Yeah. In the world. So you are, and that you put it on your advertising because you.
Yep. From day one.
From day one. Good job, man. That's amazing.
Well, thanks, Chris. So yeah, that's kind of. I just launched my 11th episode last night, so still a very brand new podcast. But the cool thing about it is that I have pretty quickly been able to get in touch with and interview some of the real heavy hitters in the category. The last two episodes, this one that I just released and the one prior to that, I interviewed a gentleman named Matt Hoffman, and Matt is the co-founder and the master distiller at Westland Distillery in Seattle. And these guys are, first of all, that's all they do is American single malt, and that's all they have done since day one. They've been around for the better part of a decade, and they're really kind of known widely as being sort of the OG American single malt distillery out there. And they're doing it, I mean, in my opinion, they're doing it the right way, 100%. And they're really well known for having really good quality juice. and just, you know, being focused on the craft and the quality, not taking shortcuts. As a matter of fact, they kind of like, I got the sense when I was talking to Matt that if something started feeling like it was too easy, then they were doing it wrong, which is really cool, you know, because you know, that mindset kind of forces them to constantly be pushing boundaries and constantly evaluating what they're doing, how they're doing it, why they're doing it, and what the result is. And so that, and frankly, we need more of that in the category to really be sort of brand champions and category champions of American single malt, and to help build its esteem on the world whiskey stage, because it's a trend that's growing. It represents the single greatest growth opportunity and potential in American whiskey. And there's a lot of legwork that needs to be done, and we need more guys like this cranking out just some phenomenal whiskey to be able to help tell that story. So it was really cool to be able to talk with Matt. A couple episodes prior to that, I spoke with another of the co-founders at Westland, by the name of Steve Hawley. And Steve Hawley is also the either founder or co-founder of the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission. And that is the single goal of the commission. They've actually drafted some standards of identity and some specific strict definitions of what they feel American single malt whiskey should be, and they have been lobbying the government to have the rules not necessarily changed, but to have this category inducted as its own thing, as opposed to falling under the catch-all umbrella of malt whiskey. And I think we're probably going to cross that finish line finally at long last here this year. So that's going to be a really exciting day for us. And frankly, it's going to have a huge impact on the growth of the category. So, and when it happens, you'll hear it first on Single Malt Matters.
So I had no idea that was that important of a regulation or a name or a category was to be like blessed off on by the crown to say,
yeah,
you know, this is all what makes an alcohol this, or this is all what makes, you know. I had no idea that it was that high. I thought it was just something in the marketplace you had to, you know, if you were calling yourself a whiskey and if it was spelled one way, it better have, you know, have the components you're saying.
yeah. And you know, it's interesting. You know, we're talking about the spelling, and that's important. But the interesting thing is that there's a general assumption that if there's no E in whiskey, that you're talking about Scotch. And if there is an E, it's like everybody else. I mean, that's a gross, I mean, that's not completely accurate, but I think that's the easiest and most general way to put it. And the funny thing is if you actually look at the federal code from the TTB on whiskey, there isn't an E anywhere in that document. It's all without an E. So we've kind of adopted some traditions here in the United States to differentiate ourselves, and we kind of hang our hats on that, and that's cool. I'm all for that. You know, we need to have our own native whiskey traditions and to hold on to those, because I mean that's what the legacy is all about, right? I mean, and it's important. And American single malt whiskey is not only no different, but I would even go as far as to say a magnification of that sentiment and of that philosophy. And personally, my thought is that I would prefer to see American single malt whiskey spelled without an E, just because I don't feel like we need to copy what they're doing in Scotland, but I think it's important that we kind of nod to it. And a big part of that is so that the average whiskey consumer who understands what Scotch is and what single malt is can look at that and have a better idea of what's in that bottle. And that really is at the core of what we're talking about in terms of the proposed standard of identity from the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission to the TTB.
got one of your fans on Facebook right now. We're going to throw this up here. Uh, Andrew Stevenson says, "Hey Matt, love hearing you talk about the whiskey and your journey."
Steve-O, good to see you, mate. He's down in Sydney, Australia.
Awesome. Thanks for tuning in. I think you might be my first live guest or my first live commenter from down under. They've got an amazing coffee
Oh man, tell me about
scene
it.
down there. It's
Tell me about it.
fantastic. I've actually had 3 people contact me already saying, "Hey, do you ship to Australia?" I'm like, why would you want our coffee? Yeah, but they want something else. They want something, they want to try something that they don't have. So it's in the works. We're working on that. But that's
Yeah, really cool coffee scene down in Australia.
when we get back to let's go back to the whiskey and let's go back to the Scotch.
Mhm.
What is the defining? So we know what you explained what the government deems it at 51% barley, right?
Yeah,
Or
malted
single.
barley.
Okay. What
So,
else?
let me back it up a bit.
Okay.
If you see a bottle that says American single malt whiskey on there, it's gobbledygook. It doesn't mean anything right now. The only 2 words that mean anything in terms of labeling approval through the federal government are malt whiskey. They can put the words American and single in front of it, but it doesn't mean anything. The only reason they're doing that is to try to establish in the eyes of the consumer, assuming that they're following the assumed guidelines and standards of production in terms of 100% malted barley. That's what they're trying to convey, that this is 100% malted barley whiskey that's made in America. But there's no legal requirement for them to do so. And there is, looking at it from the other perspective, there is nothing that if they follow those guidelines, they kind of get blessed and say, okay, now you can call it this. They can put 51% malted barley and say it's American single malt whiskey on there. And legally, they're not doing anything wrong. They're following the law. But that's part of the reason why that's important, is because we want the average consumer to have a general understanding based on what they already know of what's in that bottle. So, so in terms of Scotch whiskey, basically from the perspective of the federal government here in America, it's whiskey that has been produced in Scotland. Now in Scotland, they've got other requirements, obviously 100% malted barley. And when you're talking about single malt, you're actually talking about 2 things. That's 2 terms. Single meaning one single distillery, and then malt meaning 100% malted barley. If you see the word blended malt, that means that it's more than one distillery, 100% malted barley, and they've just blended to hit a specific flavor profile. Or single grain whiskey or blended grain whiskey. And when they use the term grain, that's kind of their catch-all for saying, yeah, it's mostly or some malted barley, but there's other stuff in it. That said, the vast majority of what they're cranking out is single malt. So that's why they can get away with that catch-all, because there aren't a whole lot of other whiskeys coming from Scotland that fit that grain nomenclature requirement.
Right. And so even if they're blending different batches, but it's all from the same distillery, they can say it's still single malt.
Yeah. And as a matter of fact, they do.
Right.
That's exactly what they do. Like if you see a Lagavulin or an Ardbeg or a Macallan, or the Glenrothes, all of them, in terms of their staple and their flagship labels, they have to. It's like going back to Starbucks.
Yeah.
If anybody who's close to coffee knows that you can pick up 2 bags of breakfast blend from Starbucks, and the beans in those bags are going to be completely different. They're going to come from different origins, but they're going to taste exactly the same. And that's because they get beans from all over the world in their roasting facilities, and they have to roast them to particular profiles and then blend them to hit their flavor targets and the flavor profiles for that label. It's no different than whiskey. It's exactly the same. So if you see like a Macallan 15 Fine Oak, there's a specific flavor profile that they need in order to put it in that bottle and put that label on there, because that's what their customers who regularly buy that stuff expect. And that actually brings me to another point in terms of legal requirements for whiskey. And it's the same in Scotland as it is here. If you see an age stated bottle, like if you see a Macallan 15-year-old, that age statement is specific to the youngest spirit in that bottle. So you could have some 30-year-old whiskey in there. You could have some 40-year-old whiskey in there. You could have some, if it's a 15-year-old age stated whiskey, you could have some 15-year and 6 month. You could have some 16-year, but they have to blend that all together, and then they can only call it in terms of the age statement what the youngest whiskey in that bottle is. No different here in the States. But yeah, they regularly blend different barrels, and they'll actually group different barrels together. And then that's what their blenders do, is they'll taste and they'll put down their flavor targets and their flavor mapping. And then they'll look at their flavor maps, figure out how much volume they have that are represented on all those flavor maps, and say, okay, we need to blend 23% of this stuff over here with 15% of this stuff over here. And, and then that's how they hit those flavor targets. So, but as long as it does all come from the same distillery, they can call it single malt.
And so when somebody says it's single barrel, would be all from
one barrel.
One barrel.
Yep. And those are becoming a lot more popular. The bourbon tradition here in America really kind of started that craze a few years back, and it's kind of a cool, from a marketing and branding perspective, I kind of admire that. That's a really cool tactic to go out and to take samples of a barrel and have someone taste through them, and then say, okay, I like that one. Like, okay, you just bought that barrel. That's your barrel. And we will put your store name on it. We'll number the bottles, and then you get that entire barrel all to yourself, which is a really cool way, looking at it from the producer's perspective. If they've got some funky, weird barrels that don't really fit the mold, that's a good way to clear them out, and not only clear them out, but to do so at a premium. Mm-hmm. So that's, and looking at it from the collector's perspective too, which I am, of course, much to my wife's chagrin. But from a collector's perspective, I know a lot of guys who go out and they'll search for those single barrel releases from different stores, and they'll kind of build verticals around those, which is really cool. And then it's interesting to sit down with different barrels and taste through them, and people who really like to get in and, pardon the pun, but get real granular with it. They'll sit down and they'll taste through them, and they'll figure out how they're different, what the different flavor profiles of the different barrels are. And then they'll compare those with other distilleries in the same category. And I mean, they go as far as to try to figure out, one of the terms that is kind of getting abused and thrown around a lot is terroir. And terroir is a fancy French way of saying it's a sense of place. And so that's one of the things, kind of the next, excuse me, you talk about the third wave of coffee, and the burgeoning fourth wave of coffee. And that's what you're really talking about. Like, okay, it's one thing to say, you've got an Ethiopia Guji, but what was the soil content of where that was grown? Yeah. What elevation was it grown at? And then how does that translate into a different flavor profile? And how's this micro lot going to taste compared to this micro lot over here? It's the same thing with whiskey and barley. And for the longest time, there was this kind of general perspective and opinion that barley and malt didn't have any flavor, but it does. And I know it does because when I was at the distillery, the growing footprint of the entire of the company in that valley, in the Carson Valley, was the potential was between 60 and 65,000 acres. Only actively farming between 6,000 and 6,500 acres. But it was at different points in the valley. And so we would have one particular variety of barley that all came from the same lot. But we'd plant it in 3 different areas of the valley. And what we found is when we got our scientific lab analytics and our data back on that raw barley, there were differences, there were variations. And it made sense because you've got different soil content, you've got different runoff, you've got different microclimates, you've got striations in temperature bands, which are going to have an input. You've got different shade zones. So your barley is going to heat differently. And you've got all these different factors that are going to play a role in the quality and the chemistry of that final barley before you malt it. And there were some flavor variations that were coming through in the new make spirit as a result of that. So that's something that, I'm surprised I'm still seeing a lot of. And that's another one of the reasons why I felt it was really important to do the podcast is to talk to distillers and talk to growers and talk about how barley matters, and the coffee analog is a perfect example of that. It's not because if you took that idea that barley has no flavor and then you put that in the coffee world and you said, it doesn't matter where the coffee comes from, coffee's coffee, you get slapped in the face. Like, no, get out of here. That's nonsense. And any third grader will tell you that's complete nonsense. Well, it's exactly the same with barley, but that's still I think it's changing. And I think it's evolving, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done there. And that's one of the really cool things that came out of my conversation with Matt Hoffman out of Westland, was that the barley does matter. And there are different aspects of some different, like he uses, one of the barleys he uses is this kind of ancient, I wouldn't necessarily, well, I guess I would call it ancient, red/purple barley. And what gives it that color is it's called anthocyanin. And anthocyanin is what makes like blue corn blue or black corn black or black barley or blue barley or purple barley. It's that darker coloration in the alurone layer. Or I'm nerding out. Anyway, it's basically a naturally occurring pigment that is part of the genetic code of that specific barley type. And it absolutely 100% results in different flavor complexity and totally different flavor profiles of that barley. And that's a great example. It's like if barley was barley and it didn't matter what it was or where it came from, it doesn't have any flavor, then that wouldn't matter. But it has a huge impact. And even, with different different breeds and offshoots and through the course of just good old-fashioned plant breeding and artificial selection, we are creating different strains and different breeds of barleys. And that's what we're finding. Even though you can trace a lot of these barleys back to the same 2 and 3 source cultivars, the flavors now in terms of distilling and malt are just completely different. And it's really exciting to be a part of that and to watch that happen and to be able to talk about it with the people who are helping to build that case and to kind of preach the gospel, if you will. So it's an exciting time for sure.
One of my roasters jumped on here real quick. Missy says, I love coffee, I love whiskey, so this is perfect. She's actually one of my newer roasters on the site. She's from up north, up in West. I'm going to mess up Michigan. Yeah, Michigan.
Right on.
But there's so much that combines the two passions. Coffee and whiskey. There's so many. We talk about flavor notes and tasting notes and origins, like you're talking about, and it does transfer over, which is why. When I saw your podcast, I think I ran into you on a Facebook group. I was like, this is going to be a good crossover of talking about coffee and whiskey.
Yeah.
Because, I can remember, I'm lucky enough to have a bunch of friends who are into the different whiskeys. One of my really good friends a couple years ago had his uh, had his birthday party, and it was a whiskey tasting. He had all the whiskeys on the table and all labeled and everything, and it was really good. And that was when, I'm probably going to butcher the name, but right after Balcones, I'm saying it right.
Balcones, yeah, out of Waco,
Right at
Texas.
Yeah, whenever they really first blew up, when it was still the original guy, and you couldn't find a bottle.
Uh-huh.
And I literally talked to all my buddies. I was like, hey, I need to get my buddy a bottle. Keep an eye out for him. And
Mm-hmm.
I think the bottle I brought him came from up in Denton. Another buddy was up there and went into a liquor store and found it and brought it back for me. But it's such a cool thing to get out and do and learn apart and learn about. The only shortcoming is you really can't do it at 9 o'clock in the morning or 6 o'clock or you're not supposed to.
Man, you just got to pick a different career is all. And it's perfectly acceptable.
So when you're talking about barley, you always hear about the rows, right? So the American barley, is it specific to, what is it, 6 row or a 12 row? Does that
No,
come into
so
play?
yeah, so you've got two general classifications, 2-row and 6-row.
Okay.
And the reason why there has always been such a climate of differentiation between the two is that the 6-row is, generally speaking, higher in protein content. And the higher the protein content of the barley, the higher the enzyme potential or the diastatic power potential is. And diastatic power is basically just a way of saying that it can produce enough enzyme to convert those complex carbohydrates and those long branch starches down into shorter branch fermentable sugars for the yeast to eat on, and convert that over into alcohol. But what's happened is that plant breeding has taken 2-row barleys through a stage of improvement to the point where there's more than enough enzyme potential and diastatic power in 2-row barley to essentially render the 6-row barley obsolete. And the reason why that's important, there's 2 reasons. The first one is that, and let me back up. In terms of the general anatomy of the barley plant and the barley stalks, the reason it's called 6-row is that the barley actually grows into 6 rows of kernels. And what you've got is, see if I can do that here. So you've got these 2 distal ends right here. And essentially these 2 distal ends of the barley kernels always get cleaned off and thrown away. Ironically, they're the highest protein content and they represent the highest enzyme potential of any of the barley that's on that, but they're small. They're considered thins, so they get cleaned off, and they're also a weird shape. So they're kind of difficult to malt, difficult to work with, even though they've got huge potential. Yeah, there we go. So when you take a 2-row barley, you've got, instead of 6 rows, you've got 2 rows of really plump kernels that are very uniform, and they give you less. There we go. Yep, there's your 2-row. They give you less waste. There's less clean off. There's less dockage, and just, it's generally speaking a more consistent barley, and it's easier to malt. It's easier to work with, and it's also higher in potential extract or those carbohydrates. And so the reason why 6-row was always popular is because it had all that enzyme potential, and 2-row didn't, because 2-row was I mean, they were both a lot of feed barley going on, but they were basically both developed out of feed barley stocks. And so now we've taken 2-row to the point of having plenty of enzyme there, that the American Malting Barley Association, as of last year, officially defunded all research and development of all American 6-row barley cultivars. So they're putting all of their funding for barley research and development into 2-row barley, just for that reason. 6 rows are basically obsolete. So that's when you're talking about 6-row versus 2-row. And if your brewers out there, they'll use the term 2-row in terms of, for them, that's analogous to just generally a low color base malt, high extract, low color. So they'll use 2-row for like a pale ale or a Pilsner or a Bohemian Pilsner, something that maybe has a little bit more character, as opposed to strictly a Pilsner malt, which is going to be much lower color. But then what you do, and this is another analog with the coffee world, is if you want to make a specialty higher color barley malt, you'll roast it. And so it works the same way in coffee as it does in barley through the Maillard reaction, which is heat plus amino acids plus sugar results in color and flavor. And so if you've got the high enzymes, you've got that high extract potential, you've malted it well, then you've got a lot of potential for higher colored malts. And the cool thing, again, it's fresh in my mind because I just talked to him, but that's one of the cool things that they're doing at Westland is they're actually working with higher colored malts. And there are actually malts called coffee malts and called chocolate malts, and they're higher color roasted malts that bring those coffee and chocolate flavor notes into a beer. That's where you get your color in your porters or your stouts. The funny thing is that 80 to 85% of the malt that's used in those really dark beers is the same as they use in a Pilsner. The only difference is they add those higher colored dark malts in there, and that's where they get all the color and that extra body, the insoluble sugars that create the mouthfeel, a little bit of residual sweetness. And the cool thing is that Westland, and there are more distilleries that are doing this now, kind of following that lead, but they're actually experimenting with higher colored malts and finding that those flavors carry through into the spirit. And they add this really nice, beautiful depth and complexity that nobody has ever tasted or experimented or played with before, which is really cool. And for me being now on the malt side and on the sales and marketing side, that's one of the things I'm really focused on is actually putting together and building a sensory evaluation and analysis program to be able to take different malts and different yeast strains and different fermentation trials and different, just changing variables, and then coming out the other side of that and saying, all right, now what's the difference in the flavor of that new make spirit? How did this change or this change translate over into something different in the flavor of that spirit? Because that's something that nobody's really done before. And it's, going back to everything I've been talking about with American single malt, it's important. Nobody's really thought about it in those terms before, but I think they need to, because there really is a lot of potential for growth and development, and frankly, just some really, really interesting and delicious spirits if we do.
So I know this is backing up about 3 minutes about what you were talking about, but you were on a roll and I didn't want to interrupt you. So are they actually roasting the malt at all, or is it still, you're just getting the color profile from it and the flavor profile because it is a darker, naturally occurring malt?
So there are actually, and I know this because I've seen them, coffee roasters that have been modified to roast malt. So, and one of them, the one that I saw, was just down the road from me, in Carson City, Nevada, San Franciscan coffee roasters. And I've roasted some malt in a San Franciscan coffee roaster, and it's cool. It's cool. And it's really the same process. You get your first crack, you get your second crack. You have to worry about taking it too far and knock the flames off. I mean, it's really an analogous process. It's just a different commodity and a different bean, if you will.
Yeah.
But the other thing too is you've got all that chaff material that you throw off when you're roasting coffee. Same thing with barley. It's exactly the same thing. So, and it's cool too, in that it does result in some of the same flavor profiles and flavor notes. It's just, you drink it at a different time of the day.
You can. You don't necessarily
Yeah.
have to, but you can. So when we get into we should have made this a 3-hour show, man. Because we're just talking about the grain. We haven't even talked about the actual process of doing it. So let's skip ahead a little bit.
Sure.
What? So we've got the spirit made. We've got the single malt American Scotch whiskey. Is that what we're? Is that what? Can we call it that, or is it
No,
no?
no. And
Okay,
and the reason is that it can only be called Scotch
Scotch
if it's malted, like mashed, fermented, distilled, matured, and bottled in
in
Scotland.
Scotland. Okay,
So that's a common misperception is that's why we call it American single malt as opposed to single malt Scotch.
Scotch. Okay.
But
What's the
that's the common ground is the single malt.
what's the aging process? The difference in Scotch and American single malt? Because I know I watched a Amazon Prime show a couple of months back where they were at a distillery in Scotland. The whole show was about a taster over there, and
Mm-hmm.
or
I've seen the same one.
right, and you know, and they're like, yeah, we're using this American whiskey barrel to
Yep.
age because it's like it's perfect. This is what we want. It has the characteristics we want. So
Yeah.
what? How are these guys? How are these small batch distilleries aging at this point for single malts?
So in America, well, first of all, let me back up. In Scotland, there is no requirement for them to use first use oak. In the United States, there is, and that's one of the proposed standards of identity that the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission is trying to change. And the reason for that is that when you put that spirit into that barrel, you're pulling a bunch of stuff out of there for the very first time. And one of the things that you're pulling out is a lactone called CIS3 methyl 4-octanolide. And what that is the primary flavor and odor that is most commonly associated to that lactone is coconut. So if you drink any American whiskey and you get a coconut note, that's where it comes from. So when you age a spirit in a first use oak barrel, you are pulling a lot of those lactones and a lot of those different like flavor components out of the barrel. That's why they call it a barrel complexity. You're tasting the wood, you're tasting the barrel. And that's why, anybody who's ever tasted like Pappy Van Winkle 23-year-old, it tastes like liquid sawdust because it's just sat in that barrel for so long, and it's extracted so many tannins out of that it's just like liquid wood, and it's just not pleasant. It's expensive as hell because there's hardly any of it because most of it's evaporated. But anyway, that's a different story. So in America, there is no minimum age requirement, which is another, generally speaking, which is another misunderstanding. In terms of like bourbon, if it's a minimum 51% corn in the mash bill and you distill it to the right alcohol content and you barrel it at the right alcohol content, theoretically, you could walk it across the room, empty it out, bottle it, and call it bourbon. If it comes straight off the still and it doesn't touch any wood, you can't. It's either, white whiskey or, moonshine, it's called, or white dog. But in Scotland, there is a minimum 3-year age requirement for Scotch whiskey. Now, part of the reason why they get away from that too, and this is one of the cool things about American single malt, is we've got such different weather patterns and climates in our country that wood is going to breathe and respire at completely different rates and to different degrees depending on where you are. Like those barrels, you can take the same barrel and put the same stuff in it, leave it in Seattle for a year and leave it in Waco, Texas for a year, and that stuff is going to taste completely different just for that reason. In Scotland, it's not the case. It's the same everywhere. It's cold, it's humid, and it's wet. It's just generally wet. And so since they don't have that first use requirement, that's why they pick up all these bourbon barrels, because it's kind of an interesting platform for them to start their maturation program off with. There's a lot of neutrality to it. A lot of that stuff has already been taken out of the wood, so that's out of the equation, and it essentially allows the consumer to focus more on the spirit and the artistry of the distillation rather than tasting what that barrel had to offer. And that's one of the things that the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission is trying to change, is that first use oak requirement for American single malt whiskey specifically. And that's why, I've tasted through, like, Balcones specifically is one of them, because they're making some fantastic single malt, but they are a good example because it's so hot in Waco and they get so deep into those wood staves that there is a lot of crossover from their single malt into a bourbon, and it has nothing to do with the spirit. It's got everything to do with the barrel. So, on one hand, it's a great sort of bridge between bourbon and American single malt. If you want to turn someone onto the category and get them interested, if they like bourbon, Balcones is a great single malt to give someone to taste, because it's going to be different. It's not going to taste like bourbon. They're going to know they're not drinking a bourbon, but it's going to have enough similarity to a really good bourbon that it's going to pique their interest and make them want to kind of explore the category a little bit more.
That's a good. We're going to have a number 2 of this. I think we're going to have
Cool.
to schedule out another episode of this because we're running short on time. So I always ask, how would you recommend somebody to get into single malt American single malt? How would you recommend somebody to get into it? What should we go look for? How should we taste it? How should it be served? What kind of glass? What are we looking at?
So I'm kind of a traditionalist and a purist. I typically, well, let me take a step back. In terms of specific distilleries, you can get really interesting variations if you look at Balcones is one, Westland is another one, Virginia Distillery in Virginia. They're also kind of one of the OGs. McCarthy's out of Oregon, they're also one of the OGs, and they're all going to make really tasty, very unique, different, stylistically different spirits that all fit that same 100% malted barley mash bill. Now, in terms and there are also peated expressions as well. Some people really like peat, some people don't like peat at all, and they all have peated and non-peated expressions for you to explore. I definitely recommend them because it might be different than what you're used to, but it's going to be, if you enjoy whiskey, it'll be enjoyable for you. Me personally, I tend to drink out of a Glencairn glass. And a Glencairn, I wish I had one right here. I usually have one right by my desk, believe it or not. That's kind of the traditional, most well-known Scotch whiskey drinking glass. There's also a new one called the Norland glass, and I like the Norland because it has sort of the same shape to it internally, but it's got 2 layers of glass so that you can hold the glass without heating the whiskey, which is important because when you heat the whiskey, that's going to release more volatiles, and it's going to change your experience. Unless I've got a really high proof whiskey, like a barrel proof whiskey, I won't add water to it. But when I do add water to it, it's only like a drop at a time, because as you add water to it, you're forcing a chemical reaction that's going to separate the oils out, and it's going to change the intensity and the flavor profiles of that spirit. And it's going to, you hear the word open or evolve. Basically, it's just going to force a chemical reaction that's going to allow you to taste a different aspect of that spirit. So if it's a standard like 80 proof, or you're seeing a lot of 92 proof, which is kind of the sweet spot for American single malt, don't put any water or ice in it. That's the other thing. Don't put ice, because ice is, you're just basically dumping a bucket of water in it. You just don't realize it quite yet because it's taken it a while to melt. That's just my opinion. Bottom line, though, and this is kind of what I always said with coffee. I came across plenty of people with my coffee business that love drinking it out off of a percolator. They just wanted to get slapped in the face with just really strong, potent, bitter coffee because that's what they enjoyed. End of the day, there's no wrong way to drink it. It's the right way to drink it is the way that you enjoy it. But you really need to have kind of a general understanding of how to do that going into it so that you can experiment the right way and then figure out what you really like.
I'm fixing to pull up your podcast here, so
Right on.
and put that link up on the screen for
Cool.
everybody here. So let me pull it up. I'm gonna pop it down in the comments, and then I'm gonna put it up on the screen so everybody can see it. I really appreciate you coming on tonight. And here in a second, when we get off of the show, don't hang up, don't go anywhere, because we'll do a little follow up and plan something else out, because I think this is going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, for sure.
Here we go. And there you go. That's the name of your podcast right there. And I put the link in the comments. We've got another comment.
That whiskey coffee dough.
Yeah, Josh Eastman. That's my boy right there. He's got I sent him a bag of whiskey barrel aged coffee that I've got up on my website from Muddy Joe. So it's going to be, I haven't tried it yet. I need to get me a bag because everybody's been buying it all weekend. So
Cool.
It's definitely an interesting convergence, Matt. And I really, really appreciate you coming on the show tonight. Where else can we find you at? Where, besides the podcast that I put in the comments, where else can we find you?
So yeah, asmwpodcast.com. I'm anywhere you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, Anchor. I'm all over the place. Facebook, Instagram at ASMW Podcast, Twitter, same handle. That's me, or you can just email me, Matt at asmwpodcast.com.
And we got another comment. Great watching and listening, Matt. You're a star. Really enjoy learning from you and your connects. That's from Tom. Awesome.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks for watching, Tom. I appreciate it. And that's it, guys. Thanks for listening. You can tune back into this if you're catching this at the end on Facebook. You can watch the full version of this on YouTube, or you can check us out on our podcast. You can find the Common Grounds podcast link on the podcast page of roastersmarketplace.com, or Apple, iTunes, Spotify, all that good stuff. So, Matt, once again, I appreciate it a lot. Thanks for coming on. And we're going to roll out to my buddy's music here. So let me pull that out. Thanks for listening.